Well, it all started back in 2010 when all the funds were required to register, those funds that had over $150 million in assets under management. Once they were registered, the SEC started what they called presence exams, and that's where they were going to make their presence known to the private equity industry. So they came in starting in 2012 and started looking at a lot of the interworkings of the private equity firms. And in the beginning, they were just trying to learn and understand because they really didn't understand how the process worked or how funds invested and how reports were given to LPs. So in the beginning, there was a lot of learning on their part. And then what they were also trying to do was assess the risks and the issues. So really back in 2012 was when they first started going into private equity funds and reviewing them. Well, the result of the presence exams were that there were enforcement actions given. So there was a lot of learning, as I said before, to understand what was going on. And then once they looked at some of the details, they started to be concerned. And the main areas where they had some issues and concerns were fees and expenses and also valuations. The first enforcement action was brought in February of 2014 against Clean Energy. And the reason why they brought that enforcement action, there were certain payroll expenses and benefits that were being paid and charged to the fund where they really should have been charged to the management company. Fees and expenses cover a wide range of types of items. So we're talking monitoring fees, broken deal fees, success fees, also operating partners or outside consultants. Once they went in to look at these, they also were going through all the LP agreements and limited partnership agreements. And when they looked at the limited partnership agreements, they realized that a lot of the agreements were written with broad definition of what expenses are allowable or not allowable to the funds. And it gave the GPs a lot of latitude in terms of deciding how those expenses could or couldn't be allocated. What they found was that there wasn't enough disclosure and transparency to the LPs on how certain of these items were allocated. So I'll give you some examples, and a lot of these were brought up when Andrew Bodwin, who at the time was head of compliance for the SEC, gave a speech to PEI Compliance Forum back in 2014, and a lot of what he looked at and reviewed in the private equity funds was that he saw that over 50% of the funds they looked at had some kind of either compliance and or regulatory issue. Some of the things they talked about were, for instance, monitoring fees, which are fees that are charged for a number of expenses. Could be board fees for being on the board of directors, outside consulting fees, a number of different fees. And what they saw was that the funds were suggesting to the portfolio companies that they sign these monitoring fees agreements. And the agreements typically would go 10 years, where typically a holding period for a private equity fund holding a portfolio company is 5 years. So what happened was at the end of the 5-year period or sometime around that area, the fund would sell the portfolio company and or take it public. And because of those liquidating events, the monitoring fees were accelerated, thus giving additional fees to the private equity fund and the investment advisor. And the SEC felt that because there was lack of transparency and disclosure there, that there were monies that should have been paid to the investors, which never got there because they were kept by the private equity funds and the advisor. Now, another issue is that prior to all this going on, a lot of the agreements had maybe 50% of management fee offsets against other expenses. And when this started to kind of happen, they started to increase in their agreements the amount of offsets. But a lot of these items, such as monitoring fees and operating partner expenses, weren't necessarily offset against management fees. So that was another issue.